I assume this is being recorded for posterior, so if I make an ass of myself, it'll be on tape.
Sure.
Okay. For those in the cheap seats, this is PhreakNIC 18. I think that's what the badge says.
Yeah.
So welcome you all that have managed to survive till Sunday, intact more or less. For those who don't know me, which I'm pretty sure everybody does, I'm Keith Watson, the Information Security Manager at the College of Computing. It's very interesting. My background is I was military. I did cryptography and civil intelligence, and back in the Cold War, we did okay. We don't speak Russian or glow in the dark. The interesting thing is I still have the same adversaries. It's still the Russians and the Chinese. Just now it's digitally instead of with nuclear weapons, but hey. So we're going to talk about some of the heartburn left over from the Heartbleed vulnerability. Very commonly when you have a vulnerability announced, there's this mad rush to patch and do things, and then it kind of dies down because generally, more or less, for the important stuff, it's kind of patched and fixed, at least one would hope. Heartbleed, on the other hand, raised a vast number of concerns that are continuing to linger, and there's a lot of people in the industry looking at this and saying, wow, we really have a problem because we started out with some premise about how things would work, and it turns out they really don't work that way. And that's what we're going to discuss is some of that and discuss some of the ongoing threat from this vulnerability. Are you all familiar with Heartbleed? Okay, most of them, except for the guy who's snoring back there. No, I'm messing with him. He's doing quite fine. Okay, what we're going to talk about today is what the Heartbleed bug is, how to fix it if you haven't, and some of the systemic weaknesses uncovered with this bug. For instance, is PKI broken, public key infrastructure? How can you know that you're safe? Is there a way to reliably detect whether or not something has the Heartbleed bug and or if it has been patched? And then there's, as a result of this bug, there have been some serious challenges to Linus's law. We'll discuss what that is if you've never heard of it and explain the challenges. And this is actually strikes at the very core of open source software. And one of the things that was discovered as a result of this was some very poor software development methodologies. And that in and of itself fueled this firestorm of criticism of open source. And also the issue of, once again, of responsible disclosure. We never seem to be able to get away from that issue. Okay, how Heartbleed basically ticks is the OpenSSL crypto library had a buffer overread bug, which is different. An overflow means you can pump data into a buffer and go past the end, causing another process that might be reading that memory to execute code it hadn't intended. A buffer overread is where you can get your process to read past the end of the memory it's allocated to read. Well, that's a problem if your keys, for instance, and passwords are in memory. It would allow you to read the passwords or the private key out of memory, for instance, a website. And this was not a bug in the actual TLS protocol itself. It was a bug in the implementation of the TLS protocol. It was an implementation error for what's called the heartbeat function. The heartbeat function is essentially websites and these types of services are stateless, meaning they don't keep track of state. It's not a nailed-up connection. What the heartbeat function does is simulate a nailed-up connection like you would have with SSH, for instance, so that you can continue to have cryptographic communications. The biggest problem with this is it allowed an attacker to recover the private key of a website. So that meant if your bank, if their private key was compromised, this would allow me to bring up a completely legitimate, as far as HTTPS is concerned, copy of the bank site, and you would not be able to tell because I have their key. It's been signed by the certificate authorities. We can compromise all your data. It's bad. And it affected virtually every HTTPS site on the internet. There were some that were not, but the vast majority of them were. Now, the really awful part of this particular bug is because of the way it works, there are no logs generated when somebody exercises the bugs. There's no way to detect that somebody's actually attacking you short of doing full PCAPs. which I'm sure all of you do on your equipment, right?
Oh, yeah.
And monitor them actively, yeah. That's what everybody thinks we do, yes.
You didn't say anything about logging them. You can capture it. Right.
Well, you can log full PCAPs. In fact, there are quite a few. This is something interesting that's come out since this. There was a lot of question as to whether or not, since this bug was out in the wild for roughly 2 years, I think, 3 years.
20.
Yeah, it was there, but no one knew it. And they said, well, what if somebody did? Were they exercising it? Well, it just so happens there's a lot of research projects that actually do full PCAPs all the time and keep years of data for doing network analysis, malware analysis, stuff like that, mostly in academia, except for some TLAs, which we won't mention here for the sake of not becoming a Snowden. So they went back and analyzed a bunch of these PCAPs and found out that they found no evidence of anybody actually exercising this bug until after it was announced. So that's an interesting thing. But the other problem is IDSs can't reliably detect the Heartbleed bug. The reason is, it's not like you can run a regex on it. And there's, by the way, if you see these, hey, my slides are not.
Bad thing on the projector.
Okay, help me fix this yesterday, remember? Yeah, it's definitely not. There we go. Daddy had to touch it, and then it's okay. So, the problem is, if you go to any of these blue links you see here, if you download the slides, these are links to the actual references where this is all referenced. Now, I realize that sometimes you don't have the software to view these slides. They're also in PDF format. At the end of the slides is a link to my webpage and also the actual URLs themselves, so you can always just type them in. So you're not stuck with looking at a blue link and having no idea where I got the information. Thou shalt not step on the power strip while talking, which is what I just did. The problem is IDSs cannot reliably detect this. As soon as they came out with an IDS rule for it, several people promptly, within less than 24 hours, came out and said, oh, by the way, I've got a bypass for your IDS. And there's so many ways you can mix it up. And you can do it dynamically. So you can sit there and try all kinds of permutations and get past their IDS filter because it's not possible for them to have all the permutations. As a result, people didn't patch, they just hide behind an IDS. So when you test to see if they're vulnerable or not, the IDS may be blocking you because of the method you're using, but in fact, they're wide open and you just don't know it. That means your data is at risk because they're not patching your system. And there's no way for you to know. Yes?
I'm sure when everybody patched, they also revoked their certs and issued new.
Yes, he said he was certain that when everybody patched, they followed the correct procedures and revoked their certs. No, they did not. And we will actually talk about that. Now, how many sites did this affect? Well, it turns out there's roughly 500,000 sites are vulnerable, or 17% of the 2 million sites using HTTPS. That is a lot of sites with a lot of customer data and sensitive information. Now, how do you fix this? Well, the best thing to do is go to these two links. The EFF has a very good site on this, and also Codenomicon, who's one of the people who announced it, and publish detailed information. Now, the order in which you do it is important.
Critical.
Absolutely critical. Otherwise, you're changing your clothes naked in the middle of the street and wondering why there's all these cute photos of you on YouTube or Instagram. First, you install the patch. Then you revoke your current certificates. That's very important. Once you do that, you have to create a new public-private key pair. And this is where a lot of people fell down. They revoked their certificates, did not create a new public-private key pair. Did I mention they compromised the private key? So, yeah, they put a new shiny lock on the front door and keyed it for their old key, which I have a copy of. That's bad. That's exactly what happens. Then you request your new certificates once you've created your key pair. You install the new certificates and restart the services, and then you have to notify everybody who uses your service that they need to revoke their keys and or passwords or both and reissue them the same way, because their stuff is located in memory as well and can also be compromised. Or if they're in the case where they've actually created a man-in-the-middle or a Trojan site and redirected it, they can actually be capturing all of your data as you're talking to them, all your passwords. So you have to revoke all those. So many, many sites went through this and never notified their users. How many of you were notified you needed to change your passwords?
Boy, look at all those hands raised.
For those, there's about, what, 30 people here, and like 3 people raised their hands. I never got notified. We did, in fact, at Georgia Tech, we did look at our critical systems, and it just so happened that we were using old enough software we weren't vulnerable. Doesn't that make you feel sick? Now, in some cases, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, yes.
On that note, LastPass will proactively detect sites that you're using that are vulnerable, and they will proactively notify you when they're safe to update your passwords, like when they've completed this process, and they will email you.
And that was, what service was that?
LastPass.
LastPass. You're saying, for those at home who didn't hear that, LastPass is a password wallet that's online, and they will try to actively tell you if a site is vulnerable and whether or not they've patched. Unfortunately, some of them are hiding behind IDSs and lie. And so that's part of the problem. There are still quite a few sites that are still unpatched. And we're not talking just any day sites, we're talking banks and major services. Now, is PKI broken? Well, there was a basic assumption made with PKI that certificates would have a very short lifespan, 6 months, a year, and then it expired. And that the number of revoked certificates would be rare and small. Those were 2 of the primary assumptions for PKI for certificates. And that because they were rare and they were small, if you didn't bother to check to see if a certificate was revoked, the chances of a site having a revoked certificate was relatively low, and the probability of you getting owned as a result of using that site was relatively low. So if you didn't bother to check, no problem. But what happens when every single website on the internet that uses HTTPS, or 17% of them, or 500,000, has to revoke their certificates? And the certificates have unusually long lifespans. They have to remain on the list until they expire, which can take up to 16 years.
No.
Yeah, that's a minor little problem. Basically, the premise behind it was flawed. And they went, oh yeah, that's a problem. There's insult added to misery, which I'll talk about here in a second. So there's 2 basic methodologies used, a certificate revocation list, and the other one is online certificate status protocol, which I just read off there because I can never remember what the heck that means. The idea is your browser actively, before it lets you connect to the site, checks to see if it's been revoked or not. Now, some of the browsers have taken to loading a copy in the browser whenever you do an update, so it can do much quicker checks for high-profile sites, but they obviously can't do it for everybody. The problem is, you now have a central point of failure. So if I DDoS the revocation servers, you can't check. So now you're faced with the choice. Do I click continue anyway or not? And guess what grandma's going to do? Continue anyway. So if the site was compromised and they continued anyway, and they had their private key because they didn't bother to generate a new key pair, you see the problem here, right? Those sites that later discovered that they had not done the steps properly in the correct order had to do it again, which means the new search they got for another 16 years ended up on the list a second time, or a third, or a fourth, until they got it right. So this is the basic problem. You went from virtually no risk if you didn't check for certificate revocation to virtual certainty of being owned if you did not. That creates a problem because there's billions of computers on the internet. Certificate lifespans are typically 3 to 5 years, but they can be much longer. Microsoft, you see the 16 years, right? Oh goodness, slides are still in sync. Microsoft, in their wisdom, said based on the number of the key length, You can have your certificates last longer because they'll withstand a brute force attack, paying no attention whatsoever to what happens when you revoke it, and it ends up on the revocation list for 16 years before it has to fall off, which means you have to continually check until it actually expires, because that certificate is still valid if you don't check. Your browser will in fact say, that's a good cert, because it's still signed and its date has not expired, unless it's on the revocation list. It's the only way you know the cert is invalid. The problem was they had to revoke 500,000 certificates at the same time, some of which with 3-year lifespans, some up to 16 years. Global Sign's certificate revocation list, this is just one certificate authority, grew from 22 kilobytes, rare and unusual event, to 4.9 megabytes. Now that doesn't sound very big. How long does it take you on Comcast or AT&T DSL to download 4.9 megabytes? Like that. How long is that list good for? Maybe 24 hours before they add more stuff to it? So that means every 24 hours you have to download it? That they went from 1,400 or 1,500 certificates to 133,000 certificates in a matter of days. This is one certificate authority. Okay, so, well, Cisco estimates there's 12.5, blah, 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 blah. Estimated there's 12.5 billion internet devices in 2010, and there will be 25 billion by 2015. That means 12.5 billion times 4.9 megabytes equals 61.5 or 25 petabytes for just one of the certificate authorities that you have to check. Can you imagine what the bandwidth costs are going to be to check? It also means that's that many certificate authorities you can deny access to if you DDoS those certificate servers. As you can see, PKI has a slight problem. Basically, you now cannot use an HTTPS site with any level of certainty that it's actually valid. That's kind of bad. People have continued on like nothing happened, unfortunately. Now, OCSP has issues. If you go to this link here where issues is, he has a very exhaustive analysis of the specific issues with OCSP. Browsers had it off by default. Has anybody bothered to turn it on in a browser? It's still off by default, by the way. Have any of you turned it on? Have you noticed any problems?
Not really.
Have you noticed that sometimes you click on something and normally, by the way, do you know what the average wait time is for somebody if they click on a page and it doesn't respond? So they say, oh, forget it, and move on?
38 seconds.
Say again?
38 seconds.
Not 8 seconds.
8.
They did a study, and after 8 seconds, people go, oh, God, oh, that's too long, and they move on. 8 seconds. Well, it can take upwards of a minute or more for a certificate request to come back, depending on where it's going and how big the list is and how busy the servers are, and they're very, very busy. And there's a recent event that made this even worse. And I forgot completely what the name of the company was. Listen, that's special. SHA-1 certificates. Have you all heard about SHA-1 certificates? Where all the vendors got together and said, hey, this is kind of a broken protocol. We want to go to SHA-2. So you know all the certificates you just finished issuing for all your websites that were signed with SHA-1? We want to reissue them with SHA-2. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to put them on the same certificate revocation list you just put all those others on that are already overloaded. Now they're double overloaded. That just happened. So if you thought it was broken before, it's now just a shambles pile of rubble at this point. Browsers have OCSP turned off by default. When enabled, the default is a soft fail, meaning I try to check. If it doesn't work, I move on and say nothing. Does that sound dangerous to you? Yeah, it does. There's only a little problem. What if you're using like a Wi-Fi access point, you're trying to go to HTTPS website, and it does a captive portal? If you have hard fail turned on, you'll never get to the portal, especially if the portal is HTTPS, because until you authenticate on the portal, which you don't want to give it credentials on the portal, obviously, you can't check certificates, and if you can't check certificates, you can't load the portal, like here in the hotel. So the solution to that is you set it for soft fail, which means it's very easy to DDoS and you're none the wiser. This is just getting worse by the second. The other problem is OCSP, if you download it and keep a local copy, it's only good for a few days and then it expires. So all those machines have to constantly re-download that data for 16 years until the very last certificate expires. Yes?
Yeah, by the way you just described it, anytime in the next 16 years, if somebody manages to hack one of those certificate authorities and just delete their list of revoked certificates, then they also potentially own every other website who is using that certificate.
Yes. For those who didn't hear that, he said if somebody actually got into a certificate authority and deleted the list of revoked certificates, that now they could use those with impunity because no one could check. And the answer is yes, and that's part of the problem with the certificate authority system in general. And as you know, there's this little one called DigiNotar. You heard about that, right? Well, there's been others. In fact, there's been so many of them that people are starting to question whether the certificate authority system we have actually works and is reliable. So basically, PKI is starting to strain and creak, kind of like the Titanic after it hit the iceberg. And we're wondering, how are we going to fix this? This was our best idea, and it kind of is going down in the North Atlantic. So we're not sure what to do about this. And also, OCSP can easily be DDoSed. That's yet another problem. Now, how do you know if you're safe? I stepped on it again. Okay. How do you know if you're safe? Well, the problem is, Heartbleed didn't just affect web servers. Have you got any devices that use SSL, like your home router? Have you patched your home router? Can you patch your home router? Do they even have an operating system for it or a patch for it? I don't know about you, but my Linksys WRT54G series routers, they haven't released an update for those since like 2009. It's got more holes in it like a sieve. And the other problem is if you're using a third-party operating system like OpenWRT or Tomato or DDWRT, they haven't been developing for those either. The only version of the operating system still actively under development being patched that I'm aware of is Tomato by Shibby, which is what we're running on the routers here. They were patched as of about a few weeks ago. That's it. So that means all of that equipment is becoming obsolete simply because the vendors aren't supporting it anymore. And neither are we. So what you get to do is go buy the new Linksys that costs $300 retail, $214 if you can get it really cheap, that they supposedly developed in coordination with OpenWRT. If you believe that's true, go look at OpenWRT's presentation at last year's Chaos Communications Congress, where they basically blow holes in that and say that they only gave it lip service so they could claim they did it in support with OpenWRT, for those who are interested. So I'm now personally going to start building my own wireless access points and experiment with those, because for $200 I can build something far better than something Linksys gives me. So you have home routers. You also have commercial routers like Cisco and Juniper. Do they do SSL? Yes. Well, they're vulnerable. Are any of you using older Cisco equipment that has gone out of support? Congratulations, you got to buy new switches. They're not going to patch it, assuming it has the vulnerability. A lot of them don't, but how do you know? You have to go check for all those devices. Have any of you checked? We've been running around like crazy. I'm still trying to figure out if some of my home equipment is compromised. It took me a while to figure out whether my routers were compromised. How many of you have one of these little guys? Cell phones? Is it more than about a year old? It's probably not supported by the vendor anymore. They have the vulnerability. Have you patched them? Probably not. Industrial control systems, SCADA, they're bad enough as it is, but now they're even worse. Other software, including client software such as OpenVPN, FreeRadius, Asterisk, Curl, Tor, and many more, rely on this technology. So if you have any devices like a Ready NAS at home that has HTTPS on it, is using SSL to encrypt sessions, you gotta patch it. Or at least keep it behind a firewall. Or if somebody gets a foothold behind your firewall, they're gonna own your box and then, hey, you got a problem, you got access to your data. So you can see this had a lot more ramifications than people fully expected up front, and a lot of people haven't paid any attention to it. We've been running around trying to just figure out the scope of the problem, and we haven't got our hands around it. We've been working on it for months. Not everybody patched, okay? On June 21st, a report came out that 300,000 vulnerable 2 months out, were still vulnerable 2 months after the event. They hadn't patched. On July 18th, it was discovered in industrial control systems were unpatched. On July 29th, only 3% of the web servers in the top corporations were patched. They were hiding behind IDSs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That, by the way, did I mention you can bypass the IDS and get right in using this, and there's no logs. Oh, isn't that great? Don't you feel safe now? My job, by the way, is to scare you so bad you go home, unplug your router, and hide under the bed with it. Just so you know. Hiding behind an IDS may not protect you, which we talked about. There are active attacks. The question is, has anybody used this to actually do anything evil? Yes. Some of them we don't know about. These are a few that we do. The Canadian Revenue Agency was breached. Cupid, have you ever heard of Cupid? It's a man-in-the-middle attack. Spawned an evil Wi-Fi network. The idea is a little device kind of like a pineapple, you run this thing, and it deliberately takes advantage of the Heartbleed bug to own sites. Like a Wi-Fi pineapple. By the way, has anybody ever played with Wi-Fi pineapple or turned a Raspberry Pi into one? If you haven't, it's crazy when you realize just how simple it is to do. Community health systems in Canada was breached and 4.5 million patient records were compromised. A little bit of a HIPAA problem. Well, that's Canada, so it's not really HIPAA. Yes. Who? CHS? No. That's community health systems is it's the Canadian health system. Yeah. Now, what about phones? Remember I mentioned phones are vulnerable? Aviva is an insurance agency. I believe they're based out of England. All their phones, their iPhones, are pwned via Heartbleed, and they had a massive data breach. Well, who patches phones? But well, Apple doesn't. How do you test if it's patched? Well, you can go to a testing site and run it against your site. So if I want to make sure my bank is up to snuff before I go and trust them with all my stuff, I want to test their site. Unfortunately, that's a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So if you try to test to see if a third-party site is vulnerable, you can actually go to jail for that. And as you well know, what's his name, Schwartz?
Aaron,
yes, Aaron. Sometimes getting in the way of getting under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, they've been taking liberties with that and prosecuting people kind of outside the scope of what it was intended for. So there's no telling where that may lead, especially when companies are very prone to suing the pants off you if you demonstrate that they have no security. When you say the king has no clothes, he usually throws you in the dungeon. And they use the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and the FBI to do it. Tools for testing if Heartbleed exists. Now, this is a list of tools you can go to that if you click on those and go to the site, you can use it to test your stuff. You can use it to test a third-party site. I warn you that depending on what state you're in, the Attorney General there may take a good view if the company complains about it. And now that they have IDS rules, and a lot of the IDSs are tuned to detect when they're being scanned by these, they don't know whether this is a bad guy using these sites to probe them or whether you're just trying to check them out to see if they're a company you want to do business with. So they tend to err on the side of you're a bad guy. And by the way, since you attended this con, you are definitely a hacker, and hackers are bad guys. All hackers are criminals. That's the way it works. It has nothing to do with it, but that's the way it works, right? And if you go to this link at the bottom, this is a website, a Wikipedia. They have a massive amount and a growing number of sites to check for this. And if you go to the one that we talked about previously that talks about evading IDSs, he'll even explain how you can test to see if you can get past your IDS and see if your site is in fact patched. We have been testing and doing these kind of tests within Georgia Tech on our own sites, but we own them. I wouldn't recommend doing them wholesale on other people's sites. Now, it's interesting that researchers tend to pick up projects like this and run with them, and they think they're really cool and awesome. At the time, they were mapping the entire internet by doing random BGP requests with every device they could find. That's Border Gateway Protocol. Yeah, we got our ISP for Georgia Tech called and said, stop that. We said, oh, it's a legitimate research project. I don't care. Do you want internet or not? So sometimes they have no sense of humor about these things. There are browser plugins. Firefox has Heartbleed Notifier and Heartbleed Monitor. The password software, what was that?
LastPass.
LastPass has some built-in functions. Chrome has Heartbleed Check, and there's also Netcraft extension in Chromebleed. One of the other things you can do, which is rather interesting, is if you do this search where you say Heartbleed site and the site you're interested in, if they've made any formal announcement about their stance on Heartbleed and what they've done about it, you can find a press release that way. That's one way of finding out if they've actually even bothered to look at the problem. They don't always tell you, but if they did tell you, at least you know they're trying to pay attention. Of course, they can do what most corporations do, is say, yeah, everything's fine, we're good, when they're really not. So how do you know? The problem is you don't. Now, Linus's law. The idea is if you have enough people looking at a problem, problems become very shallow. That's the basis of this law. And it was attributed to Linus, but he didn't come up with it. It was actually one of the open source guys, I can't think of it. The idea is, with open source, with so many people looking at the source code, if there's a problem, someone will find it. The assumption is that someone's looking. Now, there's this interesting effect that happens when you have large groups. Everybody assumes someone's the authority for checking into these sorts of things. And they know one thing with certainty, they're not it. So everybody basically says, not it, and no one checks. That's what was discovered with this very problem. Now, some have never believed that Linus's law was true. And this one article here, I mean, it's a scathing article about how broken this mindset and philosophy is. It just doesn't work. And some believe that this is the first proof, this particular instance is the first hardcore proof that that law does not work, which completely undermines the entire philosophy behind open source software. Others believe that this case actually proves the law to be true. They are completely, utterly, diametrically opposed. You're going to have to decide for yourself what you think is true. They believe it proves it for a very simple premise. The reason this was discovered was because someone actually had the source code and did discover it. They're saying the premise that the other group is using is, since it wasn't discovered immediately and fixed, that the law is broken. And their retort was, they found it because the source code was available. If this had been closed source, it never would have been found. There's probably vulnerabilities of this nature out there, and we'll never know because we can't go look. On top of that, when it was discovered, it didn't take very long for them to come up with patches and a solution for the problem. If this were closed source, they simply would not have told you for a year or so while they worked on a patch, if they bothered at all. And so you can see there's both sides of this argument. They're going at it tooth and nail. You're going to, yes?
Thought on that would be with close, you have a full close, you can find two, right?
Well, for those at home, he said if you have closed source with enough people poking at it, you can find them too. Yes, how many of you participated in the capture the flag? Okay, there's several here. If you've never done this, it is a real eye-opener to sit down in front of a blank console and say, there's a system out there, it has a vulnerability, I have no idea where to start. When I'm looking at the source code, I can see exactly what it's doing. I don't have to guess where to start. That's the big difference. Also, if there's something in the source code that doesn't work the way you need it to, How many of you have actually hacked source code to get something working the way you needed it? For those at home, almost everybody raised their hand. All of us have made a change in the source to get something to work the way we needed it. If you're closed source, you can't do that. Now, mind you, in the case of Heartbleed, closed source gets dedicated personnel, they get money, they get research time that's paid for because it's closed source, it's a commercial product. They had one full-time developer on OpenSSL. But there's a solution for that because it's open source, and I'll show you what that is. What's interesting, there's some that saw both sides of this. What they said was, yes, open source can do these things, but sometimes they don't happen. But when they do react, and they generally react far quicker than commercial entities do. But there is a problem and we need to work on it. This seems to be the stance that I take, because there are some issues that need to be addressed, and we can address them, and they are being addressed. This is not something that you can do. You can't go to, let's pick on Microsoft, you can't go to Microsoft and say, hey, I don't like the way you're doing that, you need to change that. In open source, you say, I don't like the way that's being done, I'm going to change that. That's the big difference. Now, does Linus's law mean that all code will be bug-free? No, that's kind of ridiculous. However, the detractors for Linus's law say, well, that's what they're predicting is the code will be bug-free. The answer is no, the code won't be bug-free, but it can be discovered, but it doesn't guarantee that someone will be looking. That's the difference. What about code audits? In commercial companies, quite often they do code audits. Well, because of this, they've actually come up with a solution for that. The other thing is, if there's a bug in open source software, does it mean the bug gets fixed quickly? Not necessarily. There are bugs that were in OpenSSL that were there for years that people complained about, and they were never addressed in any timely manner. So the people are saying, hey, this is a critical infrastructure that we're relying on all these websites and businesses, and no one's putting any kind of development effort into this, and we're using it for free. The software development process is also flawed. OpenSSL did, after this event, did a study and said, we have a few problems. These are lists of the problems they listed that they discovered themselves. There's others that people from the outside have been throwing rotten tomatoes at them. And if you actually, I'm surprised these guys continue to develop software. They were treated pretty badly as a result of this, considering they donated their time, and absolutely everybody relies on their software and gives nothing back. That was kind of rude. Because it's open source, there are options that are not available to closed source. The Linux Foundation is going to fund a security audit and 2 full-time developers on the OpenSSL project. That foundation is a group of major corporations that come together and say, you know, we've been counting on this software and paying absolutely nothing for it. It wouldn't kill us to put a little money into this to kind of develop for the good of everybody. So if you go to this link, you can read about the project. So this was the open source's response to, hey, your software development process is terrible. They said, yeah, but we can fix that. And they are. And they're not just looking at OpenSSL, they're looking at the core infrastructure initiative, which is, what are all the pieces that everybody absolutely relies on to make the internet and all our services work, but nobody puts any resources into? Can we identify those and actually start to focus some energy in that area? And the answer is yes, we can. And if you'd like to get involved with it, you can click on these links in the presentation and go check it out. There are also 2 funded, I might add, forks for OpenSSL. OpenBSD came out with LibreSSL, and Google came out with Boring SSL. It'll be interesting to see how those take off and whether or not they get any traction. Has anybody played with those? Yes. Okay, he said that OpenBSD has LibreSSL by default now. I knew they had it, but I didn't know they had started including it by default because it was still in development.
I think they fixed the ERMD problem.
Okay. Now, There's responsible disclosure. There are some that hold up the Heartbleed case as the textbook case for responsible disclosure. Have any of you ever actually published a disclosure? Anybody here? I had to publish one once. The challenge was the vendor being responsive or not? And were they just telling you they were going to respond and they weren't going to, and they just hoped you would go away? Or was it just technically difficult and taking them a long time given their priorities? Well, you have to make this judgment call. At some point, you got to say, okay, I don't think you're going to do anything, I'm going to disclose. And I had to come to that realization and disclose a particular vendor because their product had as many holes as a screen door on a submarine. And having been on submarines for 9 years, that's not good, okay? So we eventually disclosed. It's a very, very hard problem to decide. Everybody who does it, you'll have one group that says you're Satan incarnate because you told all the bad guys how to do this, and there's another group that says, thank you, thank you, thank you. If you hadn't told me, I couldn't have defended myself. I don't know what side this is. This is a hotly debated topic. Some say, yes, this was the absolute best case on responsible disclosure. How many of you remember the PhreakNIC attack from 2008 on DNS? Did any of you work on that at all? That we had one of our researchers actually working on that project with PhreakNIC, and they were very, very, very secretive about what was going on until they announced at Black Hat what the attack was. And by the time they announced it, they had already gotten all the vendors to patch their products and roll out the patches. So most people had already patched before it was ever disclosed. Some people look at that event as the textbook case of responsible disclosure. However, it was like a year for that entire process to take place. And there were lots of people who were vulnerable, and they said, hey, you know, during that year we were vulnerable and we didn't know. And somebody else could have found this and been attacking us. We need to know whether there's a patch or not. They said, yeah, but if we tell that everybody can use this, and this is a fundamental infrastructure problem that is not easily solved, and if we disclose it, and they didn't know, they would certainly use it. And they were in this catch-22. So they got it from both sides. Well, that's exactly what happened with Heartbleed. These people on this list here say that this was the textbook case of responsible disclosure. On the other hand, these guys, these are no slouches, eWeek and Arbor Networks. They're no slouches in the industry saying, are you kidding? This is one of the worst managed disclosures of all time. Now, there was so much controversy over this that the Sydney Morning Herald actually did an investigative reporting of this event and said, we need to know who knew what and when they knew it. And so they did an exhaustive timeline of all the events. I've only summarized them here, but if you go click on that and read the article, it is amazing the amount of information this reporter dug up. It was pretty awesome. But as you can see, the guy who discovered this, he discovered it on the 21st, and he works for Google, so Google patched on the 21st. On the 31st, that's 10 days later, someone notifies Cloudflare, and they're not exactly sure how that notification occurred, and they patch. A day later, Google notifies OpenSSL. Now think about this. You've had two major service providers patch for a massive vulnerability, and they still haven't told the actual vendor that they have a problem. People are saying, Google, I thought your motto was do no evil. Don't you think you should have told somebody like immediately? And they were like, yeah, but we had an obligation to protect our customers, you know, and so if we told somebody, it might leak.
Who were the guys who used it?
Say again?
Google was the guys who used it. Oh, well, yeah, they're trying to do vulnerability.
Oh, well, I don't know that they were using it, but yeah, you had a...
I mean, Google's a giant company. 11 days is not that long to go all the way up to the chain of command where decisions have to be made for them to issue a press release. You know, I mean, 11 days, that sounds pretty fast. How fast would AT&T would react?
I mean, I'm sure it has to be evaluated
Someone
by
has to
legal.
make a decision to publicly disclose that information because it's going to affect the whole company. Just to get to the corporate offices, that had to take like a week.
And that's, your point is very well taken. In fact, there was a lot of questions about, why did you take so long? Well, I don't know about you, but Georgia Tech doesn't do anything without talking to legal first, and that could take a while.
Right.
Did I mention that some of the key players involved in this were on vacation at the time? So that's what's interesting when we look at this sequence of events. There were these what looked like extremely long delays, but they weren't really due to somebody actually trying to do something evil. Yes.
The point is, on 321, they didn't have to publicly disclose this. They could have talked to OpenSSL immediately. I mean, that's one IRC jumping in a chat room and or maybe that could get a phone call.
Jump in IRC and talk about a
No,
disclosure without
not a phone call,
talking
a
to
phone call. Never back there.
Well, actually, there's this thing they call, when they have big vulnerabilities like this, there's a thing called embargo. And they do have closed discussion lists that are encrypted, where they discuss among vendors that are critically involved in this. In fact, that happened. There is in this, let's see, is it in here? Yeah, they talk, oh, Red Hat, right there at the bottom, and they talk to Red Hat. They actually discussed with them and some others on this list, and only several of the Linux distros, like less than a half dozen, actually responded and said yes. What they said was, we found a significant vulnerability. If you want to talk about this, you'll have to agree to the embargo. Do you want to talk about it? And only a few responded and said, absolutely, we're willing to talk. One of which was Red Hat. Also, SUSE, Debian, FreeBSD, and Alt Linux. You know who's missing off that list? Ubuntu, yes, they're missing off the list. That said, yes, we want to know about this. And that's why those distros came out with the patches before everybody else, is because they were willing to agree to the embargo and get the information. Well, say again?
I wasn't invited to.
I don't know why they didn't. There were, you realize how many Linux distros are there? And also, not all Linux distros are on this particular vendor discussion list, but there's a lot more than like 4. So I don't know why they didn't respond. And a lot of people are asking that very question, like, why aren't you guys paying attention? That's basically what their question was. So the basis of this is, by the time the world found out was on the 7th of the next month. It was discovered on the 21st. And this is a vulnerability that essentially renders all HTTPS clear text on every site that uses it. Well, uses OpenSSL anyway. That's significant. That's governance. That's your bank. That's like everything. And they were really, really worried about, hey, this has been around for 2 years. We just didn't know. Is anybody actually using this? Well, that's when this study came out recently, where I don't have a link to that, unfortunately, the study, where they went and said, well, actually, we can't find any evidence of anybody actually using this prior to this event. There was a lot of speculation given the Snowden documents that maybe the NSA had been. There's no evidence that they can find of that. The question is, what do you think was this responsible disclosure? Given the time frame, the significance of this event, and the danger of anybody finding out, because it's extremely easy to actually use this particular vulnerability, this is the kind of thing that nation-state actors, would use. This is a James Bond moment here. I could understand why they were really closed mouth about it. I don't know the answer. I think, given the nature of open source software and the kind of communication that goes on, and the fact that you never know who you're talking to, they actually did pretty good. Could it be better? Yeah, probably. And that's the whole point of open source software. We can have discussions like we're having here and say, yeah, hey, maybe we can do better. Anybody got a good idea? Let's put that out there. So this is going to be an ongoing problem, especially with PKI. It's going to take all of us to fix it. This is not going to be a simple solution. Now, if you want more information on this topic, you can get my slides at that link there at the top. or if you got a USB key, I'll give you a set of them here. I think we also posted a link to the PhreakNIC site for all the talks. And all, as you can see, all these blue links will take you directly there. And there's also the PDF form if you don't happen to have PowerPoint. By the way, how many are going to continue using PowerPoint and Office products now that they've gone to Office 365?
I don't anyway. I use Reveal.js and GitHub.
Okay, Reveal.js and GitHub. Okay, there are a lot of people really unhappy with Office 365. If you haven't used it, you might want to do it. By the way, you might want to take some Xanax before you try it because the anxiety will give you is a bit over the top. Wow, I don't know what they were thinking when they wrote that. So anyway, these are all the links to it. There's bunches of them here. So any questions? Comments? Snide comments? I'll even take mental tomatoes if you want to throw a few. I'm a good catch. I'll catch it. No? Well, thank you for coming. And enjoy the rest of the con. I hope your hangovers are better. And by the way, the CTF, there's still time. We're going to leave it running here for probably another couple hours. When we start packing things up, so if you want to go hack on it and play with it, go for it. So thank you all for coming.